American pressure on Israel, not Israel, while visiting Israel, and unacceptable to Israel, to the land of Israel.
Welcome to Eyes on Israel. I'm Rabbi Pesach Woolicki. On October 8th, one day after Hamas attacked Israel to launch this war, there was a mass pro-Hamas demonstration in Times Square in New York. According to investigative reporting by Francesca Bloch of the Free Press, this protest, as well as many others across American cities, was paid for by Neville Singham, an American-born Marxist multimillionaire, and his wife, radical left activist Jody Evans. They live in Shanghai, in China, and are public promoters of the Chinese Communist Party. Then, on October 25th, China, along with Russia, vetoed a U.S.-sponsored United Nations Security Council resolution calling to condemn the Hamas atrocities of October 7th. And it should be noted that CCP leader President Xi Jinping has never condemned the Hamas attacks. Far from it. The Chinese Foreign Ministry's legal advisor, Ma Jinmin, recently defended Hamas and their October 7th atrocities against Israeli civilians, stating, quote, "Armed struggle in this context," meaning the October 7th massacre, "is distinguished from acts of terrorism." So according to the CCP, what Hamas did on October 7th was not terrorism. And in early November, a document titled, quote, "A Letter to America," allegedly written by Osama bin Laden, went viral on TikTok. Videos were circulating with American kids praising the letter and confessing that it's making them rethink their fundamental belief systems. The letter makes the case for Islamic terrorism against Israel and against the West, justifying jihad using intersectional progressive talking points that speak to the TikTok demographic. TikTok, of course, is owned and operated by the Chinese Communist Party. Strangely, this Osama bin Laden letter did not go viral on Instagram or any other platform largely used by the same demographic. A fact that indicates that the viral spread of the bin Laden letter was driven not by natural user activity, but by the platform itself. And around that same time, a video was released on Chinese social media bragging that TikTok has won big for Palestine. And on March 17th, just a few months ago, in Qatar, Chinese diplomat Wang Kejian met Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh and said, quote, "Hamas is part of the Palestinian national fabric, and China is keen on relations with it." The partnership between Chinese Communist Party Marxists and Hamas jihadists goes both ways. Khaled Mashal, one of Hamas's top leaders, said in early November in an Arabic TV interview that Hamas, quote, "seeks cooperation with the superpowers China and Russia," end quote. He added that China should take inspiration from the Hamas invasion of Israel for their own plans to take Taiwan. To a casual observer, this seems odd. What possible interest does Hamas have in a Chinese takeover of Taiwan? The answer is simple. Both Israel and Taiwan are seen as allies and proxies of the United States. Israel has had diplomatic ties with China for more than 3 decades and has cultivated increasingly close-knit economic ties with it for the past decade, especially after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's 2017 visit to China, which led to 25 cooperation agreements, including in the areas of science, technology, transport, food, and agriculture, at an estimated value of $2 billion. But in December 2023, just a couple months into this war, Israeli tech companies and manufacturers began reporting that while China had not officially announced sanctions against Israel, Chinese suppliers had begun delaying shipments of vital components and putting all kinds of new regulations in place to make shipping more difficult for them. Finally, in January 2024, just a couple months ago, Costco, China's state-owned shipping giant, completely cut ties with Israel. The company announced that it would cease all operations in Israel. And around that same time, in early January, it was reported that massive amounts of advanced Chinese military equipment were found in Gaza by the IDF during its military operations there. According to Germantes Lailari, a visiting scholar at National Shenchi University in Taiwan and a retired U.S. Air Force officer, the IDF found Chinese military equipment in Hamas warehouses. The discovery of massive quantities of sophisticated Chinese explosives was alarming because it is well known to the Israelis that Hamas only recently acquired such high-end explosives. This indicates that China has recently been supplying Hamas with military supplies. Additionally, the IDF discovered Chinese rocket technology in one of Hamas's laboratories. Lailari appeared to suggest that China had an even more direct role in supporting Hamas terrorism. Quote, one source noted that PLA, that's the Chinese People's Liberation Army, military advisors and tunnel warfare specialists helped design and build the Hamas tunnels, end quote. And most recently, just a few weeks ago at the end of April, the Chinese Communist Party hosted talks between Hamas and Fatah leadership in an effort to bring unity between the Palestinian factions. All this begs the question, why is the Chinese Communist Party, who has extensive trade relations with Israel and has traditionally maintained a neutral posture in the Middle East, suddenly turned so sharply against the Jewish state? Let's pull back the camera to understand what we are seeing. In March of 2021, Iran and the Chinese Communist Party signed a 25-year cooperation pact, which includes, quote, political, strategic, and economic cooperation, which Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called permanent and strategic. Per the agreement, China would invest in Iranian energy, infrastructure, transport, and seaports. In exchange, Iran would provide a heavily discounted regular supply of its oil. Now, one of Iran's key strategic goals, and they state it all the time, and it's the entire purpose of Hamas and Hezbollah, whom they fund and direct, is the destruction of Israel, the little Satan, and eventually the United States, the great Satan. And that's where China's goals and Iran's goals overlap. In May 2019, Xi Jinping declared a, quote, people's war, calling for economic and cultural war against the United States. The official website of the People's Liberation Army explains that a people's war is, quote, a total war, and its strategy and tactics require the overall mobilization of political, economic, cultural, diplomatic, military, and other power resources, the integrated use of multiple forms of struggle and combat methods, end quote. So, if China and Iran have a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement and share the goal of bringing down the United States, and Iran's strategic goal is to bring down Israel, it would make sense that the CCP would be promoting Iran's geopolitical goals in the Middle East. All this now brings us to the Biden administration and its behavior. All of Joe Biden's Mideast policies since taking office in January 2021 have benefited Iran and weakened Israel. Upon taking office, the Biden administration announced their plan to begin negotiating with Iran to restart the JCPOA. That's the nuclear deal that Israel has always said endangers its national security. They also began working to enrich Iran economically. They ceased enforcement of sanctions on the Iranian oil and petrochemical industry, enriching Tehran to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. After being short on funds for terrorism under the Trump administration's harsh sanctions, Hezbollah and Hamas were again an affordable luxury for Tehran. By now, it's also well known that Joe Biden and his family have benefited financially from the Chinese Communist Party for decades. Many of the key figures setting the administration's foreign policy agenda are compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. Prior to serving as Joe Biden's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken led the Penn Biden Center, which received its primary funding from the Chinese. He then went on to found West Exec Advisors, which, among other things, according to investigative journalist Natalie Winters, assisted U.S. universities in securing funding from China. Perhaps we can now explain a curious move by the Biden administration. On November 14th, while 300,000 supporters of Israel were rallying in D.C., the State Department announced that it would be providing $10 billion in sanctions relief to Iran. This mass pro-Israel rally in D.C. had been on the calendar for weeks and included the participation of leading Democratic political figures, such as House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Now, why would the Biden administration choose that day to enrich Iran with another $10 billion in the midst of a war between Hamas and Israel? The very next day, Joe Biden was scheduled to meet with Xi Jinping in San Francisco. While at the time the Biden administration was still supplying Israel with munitions and other support, Joe Biden needed to show his Chinese paymaster that he's a team player. So he released another $10 billion to China's strategic partner, Iran. Folks, the Chinese Communist Party is at war with Israel because they are at war with the United States of America. And just as they're using Joe Biden to bring down the U.S., they're using him to bring down Israel as well. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a few moments. Welcome to Eyes on Israel. I'm Rabbi Pesach Wielicki. As the pro-jihad, pro-terrorist protests rage across American college campuses, one question that we must consider is who benefits from them? A recent Harvard-Harris poll shows that upwards of 80% of Americans support Israel in its war against Hamas, and those numbers haven't really budged since October 7th. But when we look at the 18 to 24 age group, that number drops to 57%. In other words, college-age Americans are significantly more likely to back Hamas than their parents or grandparents are. But even this drop in support for Israel among younger Americans does not indicate a majority who would support the kind of militant anti-Semitism we're seeing at the protests at elite universities. In other words, these protests are far less popular than one would think from watching mainstream media. The premise of the protests is that Israel is committing genocide and was founded on the displacement of the native indigenous Palestinian people, two lies that we have discussed on this program. But those two lies are not merely talking points of the Marxist upper-middle-class student activists wearing keffiyehs at Ivy League schools. They're also the premise of the Biden administration's policies regarding Israel. The repeated calls for the creation of a Palestinian state and the false accusations by administration officials that Israel is causing excessive civilian casualties and withholding humanitarian aid lay the predicate for everything Biden and company are doing to prevent Israel from defeating Hamas. If these protests perpetuate and amplify these false narratives, creating the illusion that the American people want the government to put pressure on Israel, the Biden administration can point to them as a pretext for its policies, such as withholding vital weapons from Israel, as we saw recently. Let me put this another way. If we want to answer the question, who benefits from the pro-Hamas campus protests, a good place to start is by looking at who is paying for them. Joining me now is Cheryl Chumley, who has been following this story and has done the best reporting on the subject for the Washington Times, where she serves as online opinion editor. Cheryl, it's an honor to have you on Eyes on Israel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
So Cheryl, when we look at these protests and we see these tent camps and we see kind of the same slogans and the same types of tents, and this all kind of happens simultaneously, it really points to some funding apparatus that's going on. And you've done some very good reporting, very strong reporting on this topic. Could you fill us in on what you discovered? What's behind these protests?
So, if you look at some of the funders of these protests, it's really the usual suspects, right? Either directly or indirectly, money is flowing into this protest movement through the George Soros Open Society Foundations, the Tide Foundations, the Rockefeller Brothers Trust, and the Hyatt heirs, Nick and Susan Pritzker. And interesting about those two is that while their money has flown into the protests on college campuses now, the very anti-Semitic, ugly protests, they've also had a history of donating directly to Joe Biden, most recently $300,000 to his campaign. So the ties between the Democrat Party, even the Joe Biden campaign, and the funders of these anti-Semitic protests are very close, very uncomfortable.
Well, Cheryl, there's a number of Jews in that list that you just shared, and we know that some of the organizations that are leading the protests are Jewish student organizations, which of course is a question that we've dealt with on the show, and it's something that confuses a lot of Americans. Why are there Jews who are anti-Israel here? But the larger question that one could ask, based on what you're saying, is what do they gain by this? Why would Biden donors who know the polling, they know the public sentiment, why would they be funding these protests? What interest do they have in setting campuses aflame with pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish demonstrations?
That's a really good question, right? And so you can take it in two parts because it's interesting to many Americans why Jews support the Democrat Party when the Democrat Party seems so anti-Semitic at root, and especially in recent years where they've been outed for their anti-Semitism. And I think that goes back to the history of the founding of Israel, right, which was based on a founding of a socialist ideal. Socialism was their ideology. And a lot of that runs through the nation right now with the kibbutzes and so forth. So you could make the case that many Jews in America who vote Democrat are looking at it from the point of view of socialism and so forth. But from the Democrat Party specifically, the Joe Biden campaign, this White House and so forth, their reasons for supporting these uprisings on college campuses is really a step back at the larger view of their agenda. And that is basically to crumble the Constitution from within our own borders, and to usher in some sort of government that was more in line with Marxism and communism and collectivism. And one way the Democrat Party achieves that is by dividing and conquering. And so they are exploiting the ignorance of many of these protesters on the college campuses to bring in this sort of greater goal to crumble America.
So what you're describing, it seems like this is 2024's version of the George Floyd protests with the Palestinian cause standing in for George Floyd, but the same script being run again.
That's a very good way to look at it, right? George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, the Antifa movement. These are all part and parcel of what the more globalist thinking in America see as tools to use to divide America and ultimately destroy America's freedoms. Because after all, America has been the great stumbling block to many of these globalist designs, right? We've discussed the Great Reset. We know what's taking place there. And America has been historically the stumbling block. And why? Because in our country, our rights come from God, and government is only there to preserve and protect those rights. So that really keeps the communist-minded at bay. It prevents them from ushering in a total top-down government control, because we as individuals know that we have individual rights that are rooted in a creator. Well, look at what's going on now in America, the turn down the path towards socialism, which comes simultaneously a turn away from God in this country. And you see that these globalist-minded have a chance like no other to usher in their globalist viewpoints and their agenda in America. And these campus protests are just being exploited for that end.
Cheryl, you said a few minutes ago that you see that the Jewish support for Israel was kind of rooted in the socialism is the tide of socialism. And it's true, the vast majority of Jews in America are progressive left, and certainly the Jews that you mentioned as funders here. But I would argue, and again, I'm speaking as a Jew who's currently in Israel and obviously been a member of the Jewish community my whole life. I think a lot of it is also this kind of Holocaust mentality that a lot of American Jews see Israel as this refuge and response to the Holocaust, but they don't want it to be anything more than that. And the fact that Israel has become a more religious, less socialist, more right-wing, more nationalist country over the last few years has really led a lot of these secular progressive Jews to move away from support for Israel. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of the younger Jews on campus supporting it, supporting and leading these protests. One topic I'd like to talk about with you that I see that you've also written a lot about is this whole obsession by the Biden administration and by the world to prevent Israel from going into Rafah. So we're coming up on a break in about 2 minutes, but that's still plenty of time to get started on it. And I'd like to hold you over for a second segment. But if you could just share your initial thoughts as we get into this conversation, and I have what to say, but why do you think it is that the Biden administration is so hell-bent on preventing Israel from destroying Hamas?
Well, they're throwing Israel under a bus. I don't know how else to characterize it. And on one hand, they're trying to act and put forth a narrative that they are solidly on the side of Israel. But on the other hand, if you look at their actions and you look at their other rhetoric coming out of this White House, it says otherwise.
Yeah, and I think back to the Trump administration, and when Donald Trump was in office, Israel, a lot of people don't realize this, but the 3 years in Israel's history from 1948 till today that had the fewest terrorist casualties were the years 2018, 19, and 20. Actually, 20 was the lowest, 19 was the second lowest, and 18 was the third lowest in Israel's history. And you could really draw a straight line from Trump's policies, where his policy in the Middle East was to punish the bad actors and reward the friends of America, potential friends of America, in order to achieve peace. That was what Peace Through Strength was really about. And I think the bigger question that hangs in the air over all of this is, what is the geopolitical goal? Like, what is the geostrategic goal of the Biden administration in coddling Iran and getting so close to them and wanting to appease them and never calling them out? They've still never called out Iran for funding Hamas. They've never called out Qatar, who Biden calls a strategic ally, for funding Hamas. So I want to touch on these topics when we come back from commercial break. We're going in there now. This is Eyes on Israel, and we're talking to Cheryl Chumley, the online opinion editor of the Washington Times and one of the best journalists in America. I follow Cheryl. It's an honor to have you here. I've been following you for a long time, reading your work, and it's an honor to have you here. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a few moments. Do you long to connect more deeply with the powerful sacred words of the Psalms, to pray and rejoice through the very words that King David uttered to the Almighty? The Israel Bible Book of Psalms Pray Like David edition makes this possible through an ingenious blend of faithful English translation and a complete English transliteration of all 30,000 plus Hebrew words. Don't miss this unique opportunity to pray like David and make his spiritual outpourings your own. Go to praylikedavid.com to buy your copy of the Israel Bible Book of Psalms, Pray Like David edition, today, and gain unparalleled access to the divinely inspired prayers that have uplifted the people of Israel for millennia. Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. We are talking with Cheryl Chumley, the online opinion editor of the Washington Times. Cheryl, welcome back to Eyes on Israel. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So Cheryl, before the break, we were talking about, what is to be gained by the Biden administration throwing Israel under the bus and embracing Iran. I'm fond of pointing out to my viewers that even when Joe Biden in the early stages, 4 days after October 7th, when he made that speech, making him sound like the greatest Israel-loving president ever, even in that speech, he never once called out Iran for funding Hamas. He never once called out Qatar for funding Hamas. And And that led me to write at that time. I released an op-ed the next day, basically predicting where we are now, saying that the Biden administration will not allow Israel. They'll do everything they can to prevent Israel from destroying Hamas. But I've been thinking about why that is, why they care so much about saving Hamas. And I'd like to throw out my theory to you, just as a tee up, and you can tell me what you think of it. You're a journalist I greatly respect. If you could just imagine that Israel finishes the job against Hamas. Let's project forward and have a fantasy session here, that Israel destroys Hamas and no longer has Hamas on their southern border, and Israel defeats Hezbollah in the north and no longer has Hezbollah on the northern border. Now, if we picture Israel's situation in the Middle East at that point, you have Egypt, which Israel has a working relationship with. You have Jordan, that Israel has a very good working relationship with. In fact, Jordan was shooting down Iranian missiles a few weeks ago. They're not going to attack Israel. Syria is almost a non-existent entity. There are Iranian bases there that Israel contains, but that's not really a threat ever since Israel took the Golan Heights, really, but especially now that the Syrian government army, the civil war has kind of destroyed them. So without any existential threats on Israel's borders, and Israel has a good working relationship with the Gulf states and with the Saudis. If you really look at the whole Middle East surrounding Israel, all the Arab nations, there would not be this kind of détente and conflict always going on. And my theory is that these CIA globalist megalomaniacs who run American foreign policy would have no power suddenly. They'd be rendered irrelevant. They don't want people to actually be at peace. I think that's why they didn't like the Abraham Accords that Donald Trump ushered in, because they don't want actual peace where people are getting along. They want to be in the middle of the deal. They want to be necessary. And as long as there's tension, as long as Israel's not too strong and Israel still has existential enemies that have to be contained and dealt with and negotiated with, America can still keep the military industrial complex involved in the Middle East. They can still be relevant and be pulling the levers of power and pressuring everyone, and they're in the deal and they still wield power. God forbid everyone in the world actually got along and wasn't in conflict. What would these megalomaniacs do with themselves? So I think that they act, when you look at the current Middle East, this isn't the Middle East of 40, 50 years ago, where Egypt was really a bad actor and Syria was a powerful bad actor and there was all kinds of other dangers. The Middle East where it is today, if Iran were to fall and all of its proxies were to lose their teeth, there would really be quite a peaceful Middle East. And again, then these warmongers in the CIA and the Biden administration and the Obama administration before them, these globalists would have nothing to do here. And I think that my theory is that that's why they're so hell-bent on coddling Iran and saving Hamas, because they want this situation, they desperately need this ongoing tension to continue.
So my first response is that sort of goes toward the talk about military industrial complexes, right, that we hear, which are very real. I mean, some people like to dismiss that as a conspiracy and so forth, but of course, it's very real to have these shadowy type governments operating behind the scenes and these shadowy figures who are pulling the puppet strings. And certainly in this administration, the president himself is a puppet, right? So very easy to manipulate. It also sort of goes along with what I've heard from intelligence and Middle Eastern experts talking about the timing of Iran's recent launching of missiles and rockets on Israel that came as Saudi Arabia was considering Abraham Accord type partnerships with Israel. So it seems like that might be a timing that figures into your idea, into your theory. And also, I'd just like to point out that in this White House, too, there are many discussions that have taken place from day one about who really is operating behind the scenes in this administration. And among the names talked about are those with more pro-Iran type of views. Susan Rice, for instance, being one of them, Barack Obama, another one. And so what you say actually makes very good sense. I would have to think a little bit deeper about it, but off the top of my head, it really does explain much.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure I'm happy about being right. I think the silver lining in it is that when people talk about this escalating into a wider regional conflict. The truth is, who would join such a wider regional conflict? Not Egypt, not Saudi Arabia, not the Gulf states, right? It's really just beyond Iran and its proxies, there aren't any real serious dangers in the Middle East. I want to pivot now to Rafah, which is, right now we're in the middle of all this tension about Israel going into Rafah. There was a story in a Qatari newspaper in Arabic a couple days ago that came out in the Israeli media in Hebrew. I didn't see it in Western media, where the Qatari paper reported that Israel's invasion of Rafah, its small-scale invasion of Rafah to start, was with the green light of the United States, so long as it was short and not that extensive, so that it would signal to the Israeli right wing that there was victory coming and keep them quiet, but that Israel would not really destroy Hamas. And this is something that it was leaked in the Israeli media, and there was a bit of an uproar over it. What America's agenda is in preventing the destruction of Hamas in Rafah specifically is a question that I really think needs to be drilled down upon. You've done some reporting on that.
I have. And on one hand, you could say that the Democrat Party in general is opposed to any type of strong military action that removes the idea of diplomacy and persuasion of with the enemies from the factor, right? Democrats historically do not like talk about eradicating an enemy or completely obliterating an enemy. They much prefer to pretend as if they can persuade the enemy to lay down arms, even though we're dealing with an enemy that wants to eradicate Israel and the Jewish people from the face of the earth. This White House, Democrats historically speaking, always think that they can talk the enemy out of it. And so when you put forth an agenda like this White House has done about placing limits on Benjamin Netanyahu's ability to send the IDF in to eradicate Hamas, to drive out Hamas, to utterly destroy Hamas, what you're saying is that Israel does not have the right to defend itself against an enemy that wants to wipe it off the face of the map. And so this basically emboldens terrorism. There's no other way to look at it. And if you cannot wage a war against an enemy that wants to kill you, without having to announce to the world how you're going to, wage that war and delay on waging of the war, so you give the enemy time to defend itself, that's basically, hamstringing Benjamin Netanyahu and the IDF from doing their righteous duty, their righteous responsibility to free the hostages and destroy their enemy. This White House is not doing Israel any favor by putting limits on what the IDF can do going after Hamas.
Cheryl Chumley, could you tell our viewers how they can follow you and what other stories you've been covering lately, and point to where online they can find your writings and your podcast and everything else that you're doing?
Sure. You can find me every day at WashingtonTimes.com. I write there daily on issues of, from foreign news to local politics. I have a podcast there called Bold and Blunt. It's the same thing on news. And you can also find me on Substack at CherylChumley.substack and on X at CK Chumley. Thank you.
Your reporting has been accurate and true on Israel. I say that as someone who lives here, and you've really been a shining light in this whole mess of misinformation about what's going on in the Middle East. And God bless you, and keep fighting the good fight. Thank you for joining us here on Eyes on Israel.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors. The Bible is the #1 best-selling book in the world. Is that a surprise to anyone? It's the Word of God, and of course, the best guidebook for life, the handbook for planet Earth, as I like to say. So, if you've seen one Bible, a lot of people think you've seen them all, right? Wrong. The Israel Bible is like no other Bible you've ever seen. The Israel Bible combines the original Hebrew text with clear, accurate English translations that bring these ancient words to life like never before. It is filled with beautiful charts, maps, and illustrations. The Israel Bible is vital for anyone looking to deepen their understanding of the Bible. And unlike any other Bible, the Israel Bible is a window into the divine connection between the scriptures, the land of Israel, and our lives. Its illuminating commentary focuses on the land of Israel, explaining why the fate of humanity rests on this one small country, and understanding God's promises and prophecies for the end times. But what really makes the Israel Bible unique is that it was created with you in mind, featuring insightful explanations from Rabbi Tuli Weiss and other incredible Orthodox Jewish teachers. It caters to people like us, like all of us, those who are faithful believers in the Bible, who are curious and looking to the Bible to navigate our hectic times. To purchase your Israel Bible, go to getmyisraelbible.com today. Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. A few years ago, I was invited to speak to a PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, church, somewhere in America. I'm not going to say exactly where for reasons that will become clear. And this was surprising to me. You see, the PCUSA denomination of Christianity has been quite anti-Israel for some time. You could just go back to their 2018 convention, and you'll find that they passed anti-Israel resolutions calling Israel a colonial power and an apartheid state. So to be invited as an Orthodox rabbi from Israel to be invited to a PCUSA church was highly unusual. And sure enough, the pastor of the church needed to first ask permission from their state presbyter in order to have me at the church. The state presbyter reluctantly agreed, but in his reluctant agreement, he also sent an email to the pastor of the church, and he wrote the following line in the email. Quote, "I don't think the Old Testament nation of Israel and the present-day nation of Israel are equivalent, nor should they be in my estimation." In other words, this state presbyter was saying that the Jewish people today, the nation of Israel today, and the nation of Israel in the Bible are not the same nation, that we Jews today are not the continuation of that nation of Israel, and we should not be considered as such. Now, rather than being offended by this claim, I was actually quite curious about it. I was wondering what led this Presbyterian leader to make such an outrageous claim that the Jewish people, the nation of Israel today, is not the continuation, is not the same people as the nation of Israel in the Bible. And if you think about it, there are a lot of people today who think that way. There are many, many people, not just in the Presbyterian Church, but all across the world, who think about the Jewish people today, and they look at the Jews in the Bible, and they are skeptical if we are actually the same people. But here's what the state presbyter, who I just quoted, and many people who look at the Jewish people today and don't see a continuity with the people of the Bible, here's what they're missing. You see, the Jewish people have an unbroken chain of tradition that goes all the way back to temple times. We know exactly who we are. We know exactly where we've been. There are books in the Jewish library, in the rabbinic library, written in virtually every generation, and certainly in every century, going all the way back to biblical times. It's an unbroken chain of tradition. We even have lists of teacher-to-student relationships of rabbis going all the way back thousands of years. So to claim that we aren't the same people today, one would have to answer the question, okay, where exactly did we replace the previous Jews? Where exactly did the Jews of the Bible end and this new Jewish people begin? Let me put it another way. Would that same state presbyter claim that the Jewish people today are not the same as the Jews of, say, the 19th century or the 18th century, just a few hundred years ago? Of course he wouldn't claim that. We have clear family trees. We know exactly who we are. Okay, well, are the Jews of the 18th century the same as the Jews of the 16th century? Are the Jews of the 16th century the same as the Jews of the 12th century? And on and on and on. We have books, we have records, we know exactly who we are, we know exactly where we've been. And then I was wondering to myself, why would this state presbyter say this? What was his motive to make a claim that is so easy to demonstrate as historically false? And in fact, you won't find any legitimate historian who would ever make such a claim. What led this state presbyter to make such a claim? Folks, the reason the state presbyter said this is that he had to. Let me explain what I mean. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, Moses writes, and this comes after chapters 28 and 29, which describe the punishments that befall the nation of Israel for sinning against God, and subsequently their exile and being scattered among the nations. And then Moses comes in Deuteronomy 30, and he says, even if you are scattered at the ends of the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and he will bring you back to the land of your forefathers, and you will take possession of it, and you will become more numerous and more prosperous than your ancestors. So again, Deuteronomy 28, 29, 30 describe the people of Israel's sin against God. We get sent into exile. We're in exile for a long time. Deuteronomy 29, verse 22, even refers to it as till the last era or the last generation. The Hebrew word dor, meaning generation, really means an era. Many of the English translations have it as the later generation. But the Hebrew is pretty clear, Hador Ha'acharon, the last generation, that we're going to be in exile till the end of time. But then, after that exile, there will be a point in the distant future in history, after thousands of years, that the nation of Israel will be gathered back, come back to our land, take possession of it, and become more numerous and more prosperous than ever before. And folks, every word of what I just said has come true. The Jewish people spent thousands of years in exile, and we have returned to the land, and there are more Jews in the land of Israel today than ever before, and Israel is an economic success. We are a prosperous nation. Now, there's more verses to that prophecy that come later that have not yet been fulfilled about the full return to God spiritually, which the Jewish people are still working on. But that prophecy is the reason why this state presbyter had to say what he said. Is it becoming clear to you yet? Let me explain further. You see, if this state presbyter would accept the historical fact that the Jewish people today are the descendants of, the extension of, the Jewish people, the people of Israel in the Bible, then he's forced to face the fact that the people of Israel, as foretold in the Bible, have actually returned to the land of Israel. So why would a state presbyter, a Christian who knows and believes in the Bible ostensibly, be opposed to believing that the nation of Israel has returned to the land of Israel in our day? Because if he recognizes that as true, he can't be anti-Israel. The only way he could remain anti-Israel is if he claims that the nation of Israel today in the land is not the same nation of Israel, or if he were to claim that we somehow lost our covenant. Now, there are many, many Christians who believe that the nation of Israel, by sinning against God, have lost our right to return to the land and have lost our covenant. But here's the amazing thing about that belief. I mentioned Deuteronomy 29, and I want to read to you now a few verses from that prophecy. This is Moses speaking to the people of Israel in the weeks before his death. And he writes, "Your children who follow you in the last generation," or mistranslated as the later generations, "and foreigners who come from distant lands will see the calamities that have fallen upon the land and the diseases with which the Lord has afflicted it. The whole land will be a burning waste of salt and sulfur, nothing planted, nothing sprouting, no vegetation growing on it." And sure enough, the land of Israel was desolate for most of its history of the last 2,000 years. "And the nations will ask, why has the Lord done this to the land? Why the burning anger of God? And the answer will be, it is because this people has abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the covenant he made with them when he brought them out of Egypt. They went off and worshiped other gods and bowed down to them. gods they did not know, gods he had not given to them. Therefore, the Lord's anger burned against this land, so he brought upon it all the curses written in this book. And in furious anger and in great wrath, the Lord uprooted them from their land and thrust them into another land, as it is today. And Moses closes out the passage with verse 29, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law. Let me sum this up for you. The Bible here is saying that in the future, there will be people who will see the desolation of the land of Israel and the exile of the nation of Israel and will come to the conclusion that the people of Israel have lost their covenant. The Bible predicts it. The Bible says people will make that mistake. And the verses that follow this prophecy say, however, they have not lost their covenant. God will bring them back to their land and make us more numerous and more prosperous than our ancestors. Deuteronomy 30 follows Deuteronomy 29. So isn't this ironic that people in the world today, Christians in the world today, who believe that the nation of Israel, that the Jewish people has lost our covenant, are actually committing a mistake that was prophesied about in the Bible. The Bible predicted that they would make that mistake and then said, but they're wrong. The nation of Israel is going to return to their land, and in our day we can say, we have returned to our land. Folks, this is a time that challenges us. It challenges us theologically, and it challenges us with all the struggles that we have. But we must be very clear. The return of the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, to our land after thousands of years of exile is a fulfillment of God's word. It's a fulfillment of the most repeated prophecy in the Bible. And it is the greatest miracle that we are witnessing in our day and age. So when you stand for Israel on behalf of the nation of Israel being strong in our land, you are defending the fulfillment of God's word in the Bible. Because the Jewish people today, the extension, the continuation, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Jewish people of ancient times have returned to our land. We have fulfilled the words of the Bible by doing so. And God bless the millions of Bible-believing, faithful Christians who stand alongside us and give strength to the Word of God. Thank you for watching Eyes on Israel.